The sun rose slowly over the rolling fields of medieval Europe. A pale light spread across the misty meadows, revealing a cluster of thatched rooftops, low cottages, and the faint ribbon of smoke twisting into the cool morning air. This was the site of a medieval village, the smallest but most vital unit of life in the Middle Ages. It was here, in these modest settlements, that nearly 90% of the population lived and worked, sustaining the castles, towns, and kingdoms that history remembers. The world of kings and knights may have defined the age, but it was the village that kept it alive. Every loaf of bread, every piece of cloth, every tilled acre began here. To understand the Middle Ages, one must first understand the rhythm of life in a village, ordinary, repetitive, yet essential. Dawn and daily rhythm. The day began early. Before the first rays touched the church spire, villagers were already awake. The cockerels crow, the clatter of wooden buckets, and the soft lowing of cattle filled the air. Life followed the light, sunrise to sunset, for few could afford candles or oil lamps to extend the hours. A typical village contained between 20 and 50 households, spread along dirt paths and surrounded by farmland. At its heart stood the church, both spiritual and social center. Nearby, a green or open space was used for meetings, gatherings, and sometimes markets. Cottages were simple. Timber frames packed with wattle and daub, roofs of straw or reeds, and a single smoky hearth that warmed and blackened the ceiling beams above. Inside, there was little furniture, a rough table, stools, chests for storage, and straw beds shared by entire families. The walls were bare, the air heavy with the smell of wood smoke, animals, and human labor. It was not comfort that defined these homes, but survival. The work of the fields. As the light strengthened, the village emptied into the fields. Most men were bound to the land as peasants or serfs. They did not own the fields they worked. They cultivated them for the local lord in return for protection and a small plot for their own families. Every week they owed a certain number of labor days, known as corvée, working the lord's demesne fields or repairing roads and fences. Farming followed the unchanging rhythm of the seasons. In spring, they plowed and sowed. In summer, they weeded and tended crops. In autumn, they harvested wheat, rye, and barley, the lifeblood of the village. Winter was for mending tools, feeding livestock, and praying the stored grain would last. Tools were simple: wooden plows tipped with iron, scythes, sickles, and hoes. Oxen pulled the plow, guided by farmers walking barefoot through the mud. It was grueling work, from dawn to dusk. Every hand, even those of children, had a role. The fertility of the land depended on rotation. One field planted, one fallow. Wherever soil was poor, manure was spread by hand. Every harvest was a gamble between weather, pests, and luck. A single failed crop could mean hunger for an entire year. The village hierarchy. Above the peasants stood the lord of the manor. His stone hall or small castle overlooked the village, both a place of authority and a reminder of who owned the soil beneath every foot. The lord collected rents and labor, administered justice, and ensured defense in times of war. His steward or reeve kept records, while the bailiff enforced the manorial rules. The church stood beside this authority. The parish priest was often the only literate man in the village. He kept the records of births, marriages, and deaths, and led the people through the calendar of saints' days and festivals. Tithes, a tenth of all produce, were owed to the church, adding to the weight of peasant obligation. Yet faith was also the peasant's comfort. Life was hard and uncertain, and religion offered structure and hope. Each morning began and ended with prayer. The ringing of the church bell marked the hours, calling people to mass, to work, or to rest.
Women and family life. The life of women in the village was no less demanding. From before dawn, they lit fires, baked bread in communal ovens, milked cows, fetched water from wells, and tended gardens that supplied vegetables and herbs. They spun wool, wove cloth, and mended clothing for their families. Marriage came early, often by the mid-teens. Families were large, though few children survived infancy. Women bore the weight of childbirth, housework, and field labor. Yet they also formed the backbone of community life, sharing food, caring for the sick, and maintaining the home while men served their feudal duties. Children began work as soon as they could walk. They scared crows from fields, fetched firewood, or helped with livestock. Education was rare, except for a few boys sent to the monastery, or, in rare cases, the manor, to learn basic literacy. Food, diet, and clothing. The medieval diet was simple but monotonous. Bread formed the staple, coarse and dark, made from rye or barley rather than fine wheat. It was eaten with pottage, a thick vegetable stew that simmered constantly over the fire, changing ingredients with whatever was available. Meat was a luxury. Pigs, chickens, or sheep might be slaughtered for festivals or salted for winter. Fish, when available, was valued, especially during many fasting days when meat was forbidden. Ale, brewed weak for everyday drinking, was safer than water from the village stream. Clothing reflected necessity, not style. Wool was the main fabric, dyed in muted browns and grays. Shoes were leather, often handmade. In winter, villagers wrapped themselves in cloaks or animal skins to ward off the cold. Every possession was precious, mended, repaired, and passed down through generations. Craftsmen and trade. Not all villagers worked the fields. Some were craftsmen, blacksmiths, millers, carpenters, and bakers. The blacksmith's forge was essential, shaping tools and nails, repairing plowshares, and shoeing animals. The miller ground grain at the watermill or windmill, often owned by the lord, taking a share of the flour as payment. Trade was limited but vital. Markets in nearby towns allowed villagers to barter surplus grain or wool for salt, metal goods, and fabrics. Travel was rare. Most people never journeyed more than a few miles from where they were born. Yet through the slow flow of goods and pilgrims, ideas and fashions did travel. Faint whispers of the wider medieval world. Disease and hardship. Yet life in a medieval village was fragile. Illness struck often,
and medical knowledge was limited. Herbs and prayers were the only remedies. Childbirth, infections, and hunger claimed many lives before middle age. Few reached old age, and those who did carried the weight of years of labor. When famine came, through failed crops or harsh winters, it swept through the land mercilessly. The Black Death of the 14th century struck villages without warning, wiping out entire communities in days. Fear and superstition filled the void left by understanding. To those who survived, life became even harder, yet the social order endured. Law, order, and obligation. Law in the village was a matter of custom and tradition. Disputes were settled by the Lord's court or by the community itself. Punishments were swift: fines, public humiliation, or corporal penalties. For serious crimes, the gallows stood at the edge of the village as a grim reminder of justice. Every villager had obligations. Rents were paid not just in coin, but in produce, labor, and loyalty. Taxes funded the Lord's wars and the church's wealth. Yet even in this web of duty there was stability. Each man and woman knew their place, their work, and their worth to the community. Faith and the afterlife. Religion was woven into every moment of existence. From birth to death, the church defined life's meaning. Each day began with the ringing of bells and ended in prayer. Sundays were sacred, reserved for rest and worship. The fear of sin and the promise of heaven guided thought and action alike. The church building itself stood at the center of the village, built of stone, enduring through centuries. Its walls were painted with scenes of salvation and judgment, teaching stories to those who could not read. The priest preached hope, warned of sin, and reminded the people that their suffering on earth was but a test before eternal peace. Evening and reflection. As evening fell, the sounds of the village softened. Cows were driven into barns, chickens roosted, fires crackled. Families gathered around the hearth, sharing coarse bread and broth, telling stories, or sitting in silence after the long day's work. The glow of firelight flickered against the thatch and clay, and beyond the door, the vast darkness of the medieval night stretched unbroken. There were no street lights, no distant hum of cities, only the quiet pulse of life, bound to the earth and the stars above. The people of these villages did not think of themselves as poor or primitive. They lived according to the only world they knew, one shaped by faith, labor, and the turning of the seasons. Closing reflection. For centuries, the medieval village stood at the heart of Europe. Empires rose and fell, kings waged wars, borders shifted, yet the rhythm of the village endured. Here humanity learned the meaning of community, endurance, and adaptation. The legacy of that life still lingers in old hedgerows, ancient field patterns, and the ruins of forgotten manors. To walk through a medieval village today is to step into the silence of history, to hear, faintly, the echo of bells across the fields, the creak of a wooden cart, the murmur of voices long vanished, and the heartbeat of a world that built the foundations of the one we now live in.